The funeral of Marcus Coleman ended the way most funerals for powerful men end, with too many flowers, too many cameras kept a respectful distance away, and too many people crying for reasons that had nothing to do with grief. The Atlanta sky hung low and gray over Riverbend Memorial Gardens, the kind of color that made every black umbrella look like it belonged there. Vivian Coleman stood at the edge of the tent in a dress the designer had rushed to finish in 4 days, her spine straight, her face arranged into the careful stillness of a woman who had spent 26 years learning how to be watched. The mourners were already thinning. Security had loosened their shoulders. Julian, her son, was near the cars, speaking low and fast into his phone about board meetings that could not wait even for his father's burial. Simone stood apart from everyone, arms crossed, staring at the casket like it might still answer her. Then a small hand touched the black fabric of Vivian's sleeve. A little girl stood there, maybe 7 years old, in a navy dress 2 sizes too big, her hair braided with care that spoke of a mother who had done it herself that morning. She looked up at Vivian with eyes that did not belong to a stranger. The girl leaned close and whispered one sentence. Vivian's face drained of color, her hand opened, and the folded funeral program fell into the wet grass. She began to shake, so faintly at first that only someone standing as close as the girl could have felt it. "That's impossible," Vivian whispered. The girl was already being pulled gently away by a woman in a gray coat who would not meet anyone's eyes. Vivian did not move. She stood there in the thinning crowd, staring at nothing, while somewhere behind her, her son kept talking about numbers that no longer mattered. Nobody else had heard the sentence. Nobody else knew that the funeral, which everyone believed was ending, had actually just begun. Vivian did not sleep that night. She sat in Marcus's study, surrounded by the awards and photographs of a man the world believed it understood. Coleman Holdings, 40 years, built from a single strip mall in southwest Atlanta, into a real estate and investment empire worth more than some small countries' economies. Marcus Coleman had been the kind of black man magazines loved to photograph next to the word self-made, charitable, devoted husband, present father mostly, a man who shook every hand like he meant it. But Vivian kept hearing the girl's voice. 7 words. Words a child that age should not have known how to arrange in that order, let alone deliver with such calm certainty. She thought about calling Julian. She didn't. Julian would turn it into a legal problem before he let it become a human one. She thought about calling Simone, but Simone had barely spoken to her since the reading of the will was postponed. Postponed because, according to the estate attorney, there was a complication with a more recent document. A more recent document. Vivian had not asked what that meant. Now she wondered if she should have. The next morning, she called Camille Foster, the young estate attorney who had handled Coleman family affairs for 3 years and who Vivian had always sensed was more loyal to the truth than to convenience. "Camille," Vivian said, "I need you to find out who a little girl named Nadia Marshall is, and I need you to find out quietly." There was a pause on the line long enough to answer half the question already. "Mrs. Coleman," Camille said carefully, "are you sure you want to know?" Camille came to the house 2 days later with a folder she handled like it might catch fire. Vivian poured coffee. Neither of them drank. 12 years ago, Camille began, your husband made a payment. $200,000, structured through 4 different transfers so it wouldn't trip any reporting flags. It went to a woman named Denise Marshall, an event planner who used to work Coleman Holdings galas. Vivian's hands stayed flat on the table. And the girl. Nadia Marshall was born 11 months after the last payment cleared. Camille slid a birth certificate across the table. The father's line was blank, but the birth date did the math for her. I also found something else. The payments weren't authorized by Mr. Coleman's personal account. They were routed through a shell company controlled by Reginald. Vivian looked up sharply. Reginald, Marcus's younger brother, co-founder. The man who had stood at the funeral in a suit that fit too well for someone supposedly mourning his only brother. Reginald paid her to disappear, Vivian said slowly, and never told Marcus the full truth of what he'd done with the money. That's what it looks like, Camille said. But Mrs. Coleman, there's more. 3 weeks before your husband died, he opened a new file with a different attorney. Not me. A man named Aubrey Tillman, downtown. I only found the record because Mr. Coleman's calendar still had the appointment logged. The room felt smaller. What was the appointment for? Camille hesitated. I don't know yet. But Mr. Tillman's office confirmed Mr. Coleman met with him twice in his final month, and both times he asked that no record be shared with Coleman Holdings' legal department, which meant, Vivian realized, that Marcus had been hiding something from his own brother. Julian found out about Nadia before Vivian was ready for him to. He stormed into the study that evening, phone in hand, jaw tight the way it got when he was frightened and trying to look furious instead. Is it true? He demanded. Is there a kid? Some woman crawling out of the woodwork 12 years later trying to grab a piece of the company. She's 7, Julian. She's not grabbing anything. Do you know what happens to Coleman Holdings if some judge decides she's entitled to a share of Dad's estate? Do you understand what that does to the restructuring I've been negotiating for 8 months? Vivian studied her son and, for the first time in a long while, saw fear underneath the ambition. Julian had taken out a personal loan against his own shares 2 years ago to cover a failed venture he had never told his father about. If the estate was contested, if the will was frozen in probate, that loan would come due long before any court settled anything. You have a motive, Vivian said quietly, testing the words as she spoke them. Julian went very still. So do you. Simone arrived at the house past midnight, letting herself in with the key she still carried out of habit rather than welcome. She found Vivian at the kitchen table, with Camille's folder spread open, like evidence at a trial no one had called yet. I need to show you something, Simone said, setting her laptop down. I found it on Dad's private email, the one only I know the password to because he made me set it up for him. She turned the screen around. An email, sent to Aubrey Tillman 4 days before Marcus Coleman died. Subject line, acknowledgement and amendment. Dad, I want it done before the gala. She deserves my name, whatever it costs the company. Send the new documents to the house, not the office. Reginald cannot see this until it's signed. Vivian read it twice. Marcus had known about Nadia, perhaps only recently, perhaps for longer than anyone wanted to admit, and he had decided, in his final weeks, to acknowledge her publicly and rewrite his will in her favor, and he had specifically wanted his own brother kept in the dark. Why would he hide this from Reginald? Simone whispered, unless he was afraid of what Reginald would do. The medical examiner's original report had listed the cause of death as cardiac arrest, unremarkable for a 61-year-old man with a decade-long history of hypertension. Vivian had signed off on cremation paperwork without a second thought, back when grief had still felt simple. It was Camille who suggested, gently, that a cardiac arrest in a man whose doctor had cleared him for a marathon 4 months prior deserved a second look. And it was Vivian who finally requested that the remaining tissue samples be sent for expanded toxicology before it was too late to ask any questions at all. The results came back 11 days later. Marcus Coleman's blood carried elevated traces of a compound used to potentiate blood pressure medication into a lethal cardiac event. Consistent, the toxicologist explained, with someone slowly substituting his daily prescription over a period of weeks. Not a single dramatic dose. A patient, careful poisoning, engineered by someone who understood exactly how long Marcus's heart could be pushed before it gave out, and who had access to his private medicine cabinet often enough that no single visit would look unusual. Vivian sat with that information for a long time before she let herself say the word aloud. Murder. She thought of every person who had access to that cabinet. The housekeeper, Loretta, who had worked for the family for 18 years, and who trembled now every time she was asked a direct question. Otis, the longtime driver, fiercely loyal, who had wept openly at the funeral. Julian, who visited rarely and never alone. Simone, who had barely spoken to her father in the last year, over an argument about her art career he'd refused to fund. And Reginald, who came by every single week under the excuse of checking his brother's blood pressure himself, because he didn't trust doctors, he always said, not with something as important as his brother's health. Camille's forensic accountant took another 2 weeks to finish combing through 11 years of Coleman Holdings ledgers, and what she found made the poisoning almost easier to understand than to forgive. Reginald had been siphoning money from the company for nearly a decade, small at first, disguised as consulting fees paid to shell firms he quietly controlled, then larger as his gambling debts, and a second household in Charlotte grew more expensive to maintain. Almost $40 million, moved slowly enough that even Marcus's own auditors had missed it, year after year, buried under 100 innocent-looking line items. He wasn't just protecting himself when he paid off Denise Marshall, Camille said, laying the final report across Vivian's table. He was protecting a decade of theft. If Marcus rewrote the will, brought in outside auditors to formalize Nadia's share the way full acknowledgement would require, the first thing any new legal team would do is comb through the books. Reginald wasn't afraid of a little girl inheriting money. He was terrified of what looking closely at that inheritance would uncover. Vivian closed her eyes. $40 million. A secret daughter. A brother who had spent a decade smiling at every Thanksgiving table, while quietly emptying his own family's legacy. He killed him to buy time, she said, not out of hatred, out of arithmetic. But there was still one piece that didn't fit, and it was the piece that had been sitting in Vivian's chest since the moment the girl whispered in the grass. Nadia hadn't said anything about money, or wills, or Reginald. What she had whispered, word for word, was this: "My mommy said you already knew about me. That's why you never came looking." Vivian drove to Denise Marshall's apartment on the west side of town 3 days after the toxicology results came back, without calling first, because she suspected that if she gave Denise time to prepare, she would never get the truth at all. Denise opened the door in scrubs, exhausted, thinner than her photographs from 12 years ago, and did not look surprised to see her. "I know you knew," Denise said before Vivian could speak. "Not everything, but enough. Reginald told me himself, the day he handed me that check," he said, "and I'll never forget it. Your husband's wife already suspects, and she'd rather this stay quiet too. He made it sound like we were doing you a favor." Vivian felt something crack open in her chest, something she had kept sealed for 12 years without ever admitting she was sealing it. She had suspected, not the child, not at first, only the affair itself. A single unexplained hotel charge she'd found and never mentioned, a distance in her marriage that autumn she'd chosen to attribute to work stress rather than betrayal. When Reginald quietly assured her, months later, that the situation had been handled and that the family's name was safe, she had let herself believe that not asking further questions was the same thing as not knowing. "I let my pride protect me," Vivian said quietly, "instead of protecting a child who didn't do anything wrong." Denise's eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady. "I'm dying, Mrs. Coleman. Kidney failure, stage 4. That's why I brought Nadia to the funeral. Not for money. I needed her father's family to see her face at least once before I'm gone. So somebody in this world besides me remembers whose daughter she really is." The reading of Marcus Coleman's true final will took place in Aubrey Tillman's office on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after his death, with Julian, Simone, Vivian, Reginald, and, at Vivian's insistence, Denise and Nadia present. Reginald arrived confident, certain that whatever amended document existed could still be challenged in court, certain that his years of careful theft remained buried under numbers only he understood. He was wrong on both counts. The will acknowledged Nadia Marshall as Marcus Coleman's daughter and granted her a 15% stake in Coleman Holdings, held in trust until she turned 25. Attached to the will, in a sealed addendum Marcus had filed with Tillman 2 days before his death, was a memo in his own handwriting. Financial irregularities discovered in Reginald's managed accounts, to be investigated by independent auditors immediately upon my death, regardless of the outcome of any succession matters. Marcus had known. Not everything, but enough to be dangerous to his brother, and Reginald had understood, somewhere in his bones, that his brother's decision to finally do right by his daughter would drag every one of his secrets into daylight along with it. Reginald's hands were shaking by the time Camille finished reading the addendum aloud. He didn't deny it. He simply stood, straightened his jacket out of some final instinct toward composure, and said the only true thing he'd said in weeks. I never wanted to hurt him. I just needed more time. Detectives were waiting outside. Vivian did not attend Reginald's arraignment. Instead, she spent that morning in her kitchen teaching Nadia how to braid her own hair, since Denise's hands had grown too weak in recent weeks to manage it herself, and since Vivian had decided, quietly, without announcement, without waiting for anyone's permission, that Nadia would not spend whatever years Denise had left, or whatever years came after, wondering if the Coleman family only wanted her once a lawyer said they had to. Julian and Simone had not fully reconciled with the truth. Julian still flinched when Nadia's name came up in board discussions. Simone, surprisingly, had begun sitting with the little girl in the garden on weekends, teaching her to paint, telling her stories about the father neither of them had ever fully understood while he was alive. Justice, Vivian had learned, rarely arrived as a single clean moment. It came in pieces, an arrest, a confession, a will finally honored, a little girl finally seen. It came slower than grief and quieter than anger, and it asked something of everyone it touched, including the people who had believed themselves innocent all along. Denise passed away 7 months later, at peace, having watched her daughter learn to feel safe in a family that had once paid to make her disappear. Nadia stayed with Vivian after that, not because a court ordered it, but because Vivian had finally understood that some debts are not paid with money, and some silences cost more than any fortune could ever repay. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Mind Maze Tales so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.